Welcome to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show, whether you're listening on the radio or by podcast. If you have any questions or comments, send them to comment at am950radio.com. So this week, there's so much to talk about, but I'm going to talk about some stuff that maybe isn't quite in the news, and some of it that should be more in the news probably. But so this week we're going to talk about now that we finished the Constitution. I mentioned last week we're going to talk about some proposed amendments that haven't been passed. Talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to do that today with the Equal Rights Amendment. Maybe you've heard of that one, and the name itself says amendment when it's not actually an amendment. But we'll go through that. Also going to talk about how the Supreme Court just gave another gift to Donald Trump. And we're going to go finish the show with some bad economic news, which, again, is not all that surprising, given what the Trump administration is doing. So, last week we finished the Constitution, which, remember, is the original one we went through first. And then it's been amended 27 times. So last week we finished that. So every once in a while I'm going to be talking about a proposed amendment or maybe a couple of them during a segment. So I'm starting out with the Equal Rights Amendment because that's one where a number of people and a number of my students mistakenly think that, this is already an amendment. It's called an amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment. And they think that it is an amendment, but it's not. However, there is some debate around whether it should be added as an amendment. You may remember that, before Biden left office, there was some talk about adding this, which didn't happen. But this is, there's some legal history behind this, some congressional history behind it. So I'm going to talk about that because now there have been 38 states that have ratified this. Virginia being the last one to do it in 2020. They were state number 38. So why is this not an official amendment to the Constitution? The short answer to that is because it took longer than what Congress gave to ratify it. And I'll get into that here a little bit later, but that's basically the short answer. And there's been attempts to get the ERA as an official amendment, but the court system has basically ruled against the advocates for the amendment for the most part. So that's out there too, where there's been attempts to try to make it number 28, but the court system has not helped out either. And, by the looks of, the current state of politics, I don't think this is going to become an amendment to the Constitution officially, and probably not in the near future either. So I'm going to start out with the text of the proposed amendment and then get into the history of it and a few other things. So this particular proposal, remember, it's only a proposal, is in 3 sections. Section 1, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So that's Section 1. Section 2 says the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. And then Section 3, this amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. So that is the text, word for word. Just a couple of notes about the text itself. So we've talked before in some of the amendments about how Section 2 in particular, this is a common one that's been in the later ones where it's Congress shall have the power to enforce the law. And in Section 3, this we've seen this in a few, not very many, but a few of the amendments where it says, well, if it does passed, then there's a date that it starts in the future. So it gives presumably society and maybe the court system and Congress and stuff some time to get ready for when the start date would actually become legal. And then Section 1, you'll notice that not only does it say equality of rights shall not be denied by the United States, but it also includes any state. So this covers both the federal government and state governments. And that as I'll talk about, that's one of the issues involved in here is, this is one that says, well, states, you can't do this either. And then it says on account of sex. Notice it doesn't say gender. Okay? You'll see that in some other laws and some other proposals. You see the word gender rather than sex. But remember, this proposal started in 1972. So, but notice what it does not say in there. It doesn't say anything about an end date for ratification, which is an issue that the advocates bring up all the time in court, but they still lose that argument. It only says that it starts 2 years after the date of ratification. And because there's now 38 states, which is the 3/4 needed, supporters of this amendment say, hey, we've got 38, kind of like the 27th Amendment, which passed years after it was originally proposed in 1789. So the proponents also say, well, Article 5 of the Constitution, right? We went over that a while back about amending the Constitution. Doesn't say anything in there about a certain amount of times to ratify an amendment. Doesn't say anything in Article 5 either. So that's another argument that the proponents use, but it hasn't worked so far. So let me get into just I pick 5. There's more, but 5 of the arguments used by people who oppose the amendment. Okay. So remember, this was initially proposed back in 1972. And I'm going to go over 5 of these arguments, and as I go through them, see if you can point out or see some similar arguments being used today by people who don't like certain policies, meaning the Republican Party. So, number 1, the first argument against the ERA was, well, this is going to erode our protection laws that are already out there for women. Women already have protection laws, particularly when it comes to labor issues like reduced working hours and better working conditions and that kind of stuff. Well, if you treat them the same as men, they're going to have the same crappy conditions and the same long hours as men. So we can't have that. So that was one of the arguments against it. But, if they did pass the law, this is one of the arguments that they don't say as well. You'd also have to pay them the same as men, which, isn't happening very much these days. So that's kind of like the counter argument used by people who want the amendment to pass. But that's the first argument as well. This will take away our protection, particularly when it comes to labor issues. Number 2, the ERA would disrupt, quote, traditional family values, close quote. And we hear that all the time by Republicans. By removing the legal obligation of men to financially support wives and kids. They thought that this would challenge the idea of a woman being the primary caretaker of kids. So, of course, this whole argument turns out to be wrong. Courts order men to pay child support all the time, and they order women to pay child support all the time. There's also, alimony, or in Minnesota we call it spousal maintenance, being ordered. Sometimes it's the man having to pay the woman, and sometimes it's the woman paying the man. And then this challenging the idea of women being the primary caretaker of kids. Well, there's all kinds of Republicans running around now saying, well, the law favors the women over the men. We need to give men more parental rights. So the Republican Party certainly has done a U-turn on that argument over the years, but the old traditional family values was certainly part of their argument. Another one is their concerns about, quote, social upheaval, close quote. So you can probably guess where this is going. Like, they thought that this would eliminate single-sex spaces, like restrooms, separate restrooms for men or women. Now, if you pass the ERA, you'd have to combine them. Right? And another argument against the ERA was, well, this would lead to same-sex marriage. And co-ed bathrooms, of course. Right? And presumably, although, this is more relevant today than back in 1972, but, there was also some, presumably they would make this same sort of argument against trans rights too. Right? If this was, on account of sex, or even if you said gender, there would certainly be an argument about trans rights too in there. As part of the social upheaval argument, right? The fourth one is, well, if the ERA passed, women would have to go into military combat. Well, there already are now. So that argument probably wouldn't hold much water. But it did back then. And the fifth one, and this is, a common one, well, there'll be more abortions. Remember that this proposal, 1972, was back around the time that the Supreme Court heard the Roe versus Wade case. All right, so not surprising. This was one of the arguments, too. Like, well, there'll be a lot more abortions. We can't have that. All right, so these are the five, at least the ones that I could find. For the most part, these are the five most common arguments. And you're still hearing some of these today, right? So one thing about this is that many of the other Western democracies, right, have their version of the Equal Rights Amendment, but not in the United States. So some history about the ERA. It was first proposed in Congress in 1923, a few years after the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. Didn't go anywhere in Congress. So they went on and on and on. But finally, on March 22nd, 1972, is when they got 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate, rather easily. I mean, it was more than the 2/3. However, this is where as a teacher, I'd put however in boldface. Right? Congress included in the preamble to the law that they passed to, propose this amendment, they put in a 7-year time limit for ratification. But, and there's boldface again, probably capital letters too, the version that actually went out to the states to ratify, the proposed amendment did not include the 7-year time limit in it. And, that's been an argument in court a number of times now. So in the first 2 years that it was out there, 30 states had ratified it. So, it was going pretty good after its initial, it initially went to the states. By the way, Minnesota adopted it. We were state number 26 on February 8th of 1973. But, after it got 30 states, then it started slowing down, in part because of the ERA, anti-ERA amendment, groups were forming and making arguments and putting pressure on everybody not to do it at the state level. So between 1974 and 1977, there were only 5 more states that ratified it. So it got up to 35. Okay, still 3 short. You have to get up to 38. So advocates of the ERA began worrying that the 7-year deadline of March 22nd, 1979 was going to come and pass, and they weren't going to get 38 states. So what Congress did was they passed an extension of the deadline to June 30th, 1982. So they did a few year extension on it. But no more states ratified it during that extension either. Now, there were some lawsuits over whether Congress could do that extension. A lower court said that they couldn't do it, but the United States Supreme Court, when they eventually heard the case after the deadline had passed already and still didn't have 38 states, they just said, well, the case is moot because, we didn't get enough states anyway, so this extension doesn't matter. Too bad. And they basically threw the case out. So, in addition, 5 of the states that had originally ratified this have rescinded their ratification. And by the way, that would be 2 of them would be North and South Dakota. So if this amendment is revived, at some point, you can see some states are going to argue, well, we rescinded ours, so you can't count our states, or they would try and do it again, right? So, as I mentioned, other judicial decisions have basically ruled against the advocates, saying, well, you don't have standing now, the deadline's passed, and you didn't make it, so too bad. So there have been attempts in Congress to remove the 7-year requirement and remove that extension so that it's like the 27th Amendment where they can pass it whenever it happens. It has passed through the House a few times. So when the Democrats were in charge the last time, it made it through the House, but it died in the Senate. And this died in the Senate a few times when this has been attempted. So at the federal level, this amendment seems dead. You'd have to start it over basically from scratch, and I don't know that you can get 2/3 of the House and the Senate to do that today. However, 25 states have passed something to amend their own state constitutions that have similar language to the ERA. So at the state level, some states have done this. Plus, some states like Minnesota have passed a law, like their legislature passed a law. They didn't change their constitution, but they made it part of some other law. And I believe Minnesota has done that, and some other states have done that too. So, at the state level, there's still some protections depending on where you live, but at the federal level, probably not likely to happen. All right, so that's the Equal Rights Amendment, which again is still not an amendment. Probably won't be. But there's been attempts to pass it, and it just didn't work. All right, so when we come back from the break, I'm going to talk about another gift by the Supreme Court. So I'll talk about that and some of the procedures, some of the reasons why they're doing this when we come back here on Politics Matters. All right, welcome back to Politics Matters, South Civics, Politics, and Law Affect You here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show. Again, if you have any questions or comments, send them to comment at am950radio.com. All right, so another day, another BS decision from the Supreme Court. The 6 Republican fascists on the court, giving Donald Trump another victory, and actually it kind of piggybacks on one a similar one that they did a couple of days before they did this one. So this is another one of their decisions that has no written opinion, no legal reasoning, no legal argument on it, no justification for it, no direction for the lower courts on how they should decide these cases. Okay, so basically what the Supreme Court did is it just gave the orange turd permission to destroy the Department of Education, allowing him to fire nearly 1,400 employees, which is about half of the department. So when these cuts are all done, it'll be roughly half of the size it was when Trump took office. And you will, a few days before this, the Supreme Court also did a similar decision where they're allowing the State Department now to fire over 1,300 people from that department. Again, Supreme Court offered no written opinion about the decision, no legal reasoning, no nothing. And so I'm going to talk about the process kind of that they're doing here about this. But these are just, again, more decisions that the six, because these are 6-3 decisions. The 6 Republicans are just letting Trump do this. Now, these cases, and this is what the Republicans will tell you. It's like, well, these are still ongoing cases. It's not like the Supreme Court has ruled that, ultimately Trump, wins the case. Yeah, technically that's true. I'll get to that here in a second. But they're basically telling you how they're going to rule anyway. If these cases do eventually come back to the Supreme Court, if Trump loses in the lower courts, which he probably will. But you never know. And, that's what they're counting on. That's what the Supreme Court's counting on. That's what Trump is counting on. One of the problems here is that when there's no written decision, what are these, how are these lower court judges supposed to, look at these cases in the future? They just don't tell them anything. So mainly what these cases have done is that the lower court, typically the federal district court judge hearing these cases to start with, right? It's one judge. They issue a temporary injunction that's in place during the case where they have ruled you can't do these firings. Now, maybe you can when the case is over, they're litigating the cases still. Right, and these judges have put on a temporary injunction saying we're going to keep the status quo here because I think that there's a chance you could lose this case. And these people who you are proposing to fire will have some irreparable harm because they may not get their jobs back, and they were fired wrongfully. If the plaintiffs win the case. And another thing that the Trump administration is doing here is when they lose these cases at the federal or at the district court level, they're doing these emergency appeals to the Court of Appeals. And in this particular case with the Department of Education, they lost at the Court of Appeals level 2. And the Supreme Court is taking these cases really quickly. Again, this is another signal that they are going to rule for Trump. Because when the Supreme Court wants Trump to win, they take cases up quick and they make quick decisions. So this particular case, they took it up from the Court of Appeals on June 6th. And, a little over a month later, they have a decision. Now, one thing about these cases, they don't have any oral argument. People don't get to write briefs. They don't do anything. They just decide, based on the record from the original court and the Court of Appeals. So you don't even get to go in and argue your case if you're the plaintiff. You don't even get any oral arguments or anything. It's another problem with these things. So this is just another part of the Supreme Court being a part of the fascist takeover of the country by, giving these types of decisions. They'll claim, lawsuits are still going on. Well, yeah, but the damage is done already. Tell that to the people who are in foreign gulags after the Supreme Court, lifted one of those injunctions. The damage is already done. And these judges know it. They know what's going on, but they don't care about it because it fits their political ideology. Who cares about the legality of it? The legality is probably, against the Trump administration. You got all these federal district court judges all around the country ruling the same way. I've talked about this on a previous show where Trump is losing, over 90% of these cases that are being filed against him. And now the Supreme Court is basically coming out saying, well, we 6 know the best. All of you other judges in the Court of Appeals all around the country, you are all wrong. It's like, no, they're probably right. But the Supreme Court is stepping in again to help out Trump and continue our march toward fascism. Because, as I've said before, taking over the courts is one of the ways fascists take over the country. And they're obviously trying, and they've done it with the Supreme Court. This is one of the, problems that Democrats have had over the years with elections. And one of the consequences of losing these elections is you get these Supreme Court justices up there. And, this Supreme Court, we all know that if Biden had tried to do something like this, they would have stopped him real quick. Right? Because, this doesn't fit their political ideology, these Republicans on the court. We all know how fast they moved when Biden tried to stop or to reduce student loan debt. Oh, no, you can't do that. You got too much. That's not part of your power. But now they're letting Trump fire all these people. They're letting him deport all these people with no hearings to foreign countries. This is just clear as day what the Supreme Court's doing here. They're letting Trump basically get rid of a federal agency, which is, by the way, why these lower court judges are saying you can't do this. That's illegal. Congress is the one that sets up these agencies, and Congress is the one that gets rid of them. These lower court judges are saying, well, if the president has the power to just fire everybody, well, then you're getting rid of the agency, and that's not the president's power. That's Congress's power. The president is trying to, run circles around the Congress by doing this stuff. And it's true. But, Supreme Court doesn't care about that because it doesn't fit their agenda. So since April 4th of this year, the Trump administration has filed 17 emergency petitions. When they've lost these cases in the federal district court level and the Court of Appeals, they've filed 17 of these emergency petitions that the Supreme Court has accepted, which is mainly most of them, because, of course, it fits their ideology. Now, how often has the Supreme Court ruled in Trump's favor, you may be asking? Now, remember, Trump is losing over 90% of the cases in the other federal courts. The Supreme Court has ruled in Trump's favor 15 times out of those 17 cases. 15 out of 17. You wouldn't see that at the lower court level. But boy, you're seeing it at the Supreme Court level. So much for being neutral and just calling balls and strikes like Chief Justice Roberts always says, that they're doing up there. Baloney. And to make things worse, and to also show you why they are doing this, and, they don't have the guts to even write down a decision and use legal reasoning because, of course, they can't, because this is illegal, these decisions. They've only given written opinions in 3 of those 15 decisions. And the effect of these all these decisions is letting Trump break the law sooner. And then, when they lose before the lower courts, Trump will appeal them. And then when they get to the Supreme Court will rule the same way. We all know they will. But they're just letting him break the law sooner, is what they're doing here. So, the Supreme Court's going to continue to be the bootlickers that they are for Trump. Now, being a lawyer, I don't usually use terms like fascist judges and bootlickers and all this sort of stuff, but this is what the Supreme Court is doing. It's obvious when you're watching what they're doing here. What they are doing is buying into what was laid out in Project 2025, and this whole argument about the president being the unitary executive, where he has all the power, which is basically the president being the king. That's the argument, right? And the Supreme Court is following along, dutifully giving these decisions, even without any reasoning. And they're letting Trump take away power from Congress. So much for the separation of powers. And by the way, they're also taking powers away from the courts by some of these decisions. You don't get due process rights. The courts can't give you a due process hearing. And predictably, I just heard the other day that now the ICE is now going to say, well, we don't have to give you a bond hearing. That's not part of your due process rights. So you don't even have a chance to argue to get let out by an immigration judge before your hearing. You just got to sit your ass in detention for God knows how long before you even get a hearing. Now, I'm sure they'll sue on that, and, the Supreme Court will, in all likelihood, let them go ahead and do that too. I mean, why not? So, and Congress, of course, being controlled by the Republicans, is gleefully going along with all of this. They're not trying to stop Trump. And you know what'll happen too in the future, because I hear some Democrats saying, well, look at the bright side when the Democrats take over the presidency, the Democrat president can do all sorts of stuff like this, right? Especially if the Democrats have the House and the Senate as well. And I tell them, no, I doubt it. Well, why do you say that? Well, because with this Supreme Court, they will just say, well, it's not okay for the Democrats to do it. They'll come up with some legal bullshit. Oops. Keep going? Okay. They'll come up with...
We can edit that later, yep.
Okay. They'll come up with some crappy legal reasoning to say, well, Democrat can't do it. They're exceeding their power as president. Like they've done already. So, no, I don't have any confidence that a Democratic president will be able to do some of the stuff that Trump is doing. No, I don't have that. What the Democrats should do, though, if they do take the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they need to reform the Supreme Court. I've talked about that on previous shows. At least do term limits, or I think they need to add justices to the Supreme Court, which they can, and even it out. But we tried that when we did have control, but thanks to Manchin and Sinema, we couldn't overcome the filibuster. So, that'll be an issue for another day. But we should be running on this. The Democrats should make this part of the upcoming elections. So what Trump is doing is something called the shadow docket, right? Where the Supreme Court is avoiding, and the Trump administration, because this is why they're doing this stuff, is they're avoiding any legal argument or any hearings in public or any oral arguments that people can listen to what they're trying to do. The Supreme Court doesn't issue a decision in writing explaining their decision on these types of cases. They just say, yeah, we grant the petition, or no, we don't. That's basically what they do. Now, the people who dissent, like Justice Sotomayor on this case, the 3 Democrats dissented, she wrote a 20-page or so dissenting opinion. But there isn't any majority opinion. And this is precisely what a fascist government does. It doesn't give you any explanation. It just says, well, Trump can do this. Yeah, we're going to let him do it. A shadow docket is supposed to be for emergency cases where, there's a real time crunch, right? There isn't in these cases, but the Supreme Court is still taking these emergency applications when they're not. There's no emergency on firing all these employees. If the lower courts, after they hear the case, say, well, yeah, there is, well, then you can fire them. But you don't have to do it right now. There's no emergency to doing it now. But they're doing it to avoid accountability and explaining themselves to the American people. And they're hoping that, the American people aren't paying attention and aren't going to hear about all these secret court decisions. Right? I mean, Congress is supposed to be the branch that, writes the laws, but you got the president doing it now, where these executive orders that he's doing and the Supreme Court is letting him do it. They're basically letting him change the laws that Congress has passed. The president is only supposed to enforce the laws that Congress writes. But the Supreme Court is letting that change to the president writing the laws and enforcing the new ones. And the Republicans in Congress are letting him do it because, they agree with what he's doing. by all these cutting all these employees, these agencies are no longer going to be functioning as they're intended to. Right? But as I've said numerous times on this show, this was all laid out in Project 2025. So if you want to know more about why they're doing this and stuff that they're going to do in the future, because remember, we're only 6 months in, read Project 2025, or, it's over 900 pages long, but read parts of it, read summaries of it, because this is just the beginning. And the way the Supreme Court is ruling on all these cases, overturning all these lower court decisions, it's going to get worse. Right? And the real reason that they're firing all these people at the Department of Education, of course, is because, this is an anti-woke agenda, right? All these, colleges, of course, are teaching woke things to the students in colleges and in elementary schools and in high schools. We can't have that. We can't have equal access to education or enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, which is what the Department of Education is supposed to do, or providing special ed services for over 7 million students with disabilities. We can't have that anymore. We can't have programs to help low-income families now get an education. We can't do that. Why do those people need an education? That's just too woke. But that's the point, right? Is they want less educated people. It's as simple as that, because then they won't know what the government, through the Republican Party and the fascists, are trying to do to them. And, of course, they're trying to bleed the public schools dry so that they'll all be privatized. This has been a dream for the Republicans for years. Right? And this is what fascists do. They try to overtake the educational system and teach, kids and students what they want you to know, not anything else. And this is what the Republican Fascist Party is trying to do right now. And they're going to be doing it when they cut all these workers. And you hear all the time, the states can do this. This is a state decision. The state should be doing this. Yeah, where are the states going to get the extra money to do all this stuff that the Department of Education is? Where are the states going to get money to fund special ed services for 7 million students? Where are states going to get the money to have scholarships and all this sort of stuff, on top of what they already offer? They don't have extra money to do this. And the only way they're going to get it is to, raise taxes, which, people don't really like. So it's not going to get done. Again, that's the point here. Less educated people, better for Republicans. And this is also going to have some ramifications on our economy. You got, besides the, fired workers, we're going to have less educated people in the workforce. And we're going to have less students in college because, they can't afford it. So less students equals less educated workforce, which is, a worse economy for us. And, the rest of the world is already catching up, or they're going to pass us soon because they, teach their students. They educate their workforce. This is going to help their economies and hurt ours, right? Lots of academically gifted students from other countries come here for college education, and they stay here and they work here. They're not going to be doing that after the Department of Education gets all messed up. The United States should be expanding education, not contracting it. It's no surprise, right? China is starting to overtake us with their economy. They're spending more and more money on education. Gee, I wonder why. And they're going to pass us pretty soon if this trend keeps up. 3/4 of college students go to a college that is publicly funded, in part by the federal government, through the Department of Education. And they're going to get rid of that. So you're going to have less college students. They're going to be going more to private colleges, which can, basically teach whatever they want. And that's the goal of the Republican Party. We should be expanding education. This is what we did after the Civil War. This is what we did after World War II. Well, what's going to happen? We're going to have a less educated workforce, less people in college. Student loans are going to go up. We're going to have higher loan debt for students. And, here again, the Republican Party is doing something the majority of people don't want. Again, this just goes to show you how politics really does matter in your daily life. And this is yet another example. All right, well, when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about some bad economic news. I mean, why not? Everything is bad these days. So catch you on the other side of the break here on Politics Matters. All right, welcome back to the final segment on today's Politics Matters show, House Civics, Politics, and Law. Fact 2, here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks again for tuning in. So, just when you thought the bad news from the Supreme Court, well, bad news on the economics front as well. So the latest inflation report came out. And not surprisingly, inflation, which is also known, by the way, as CPI. Sometimes you'll hear economists talk about CPI, which is Consumer Price Index. That's what it means. Roughly the same thing as inflation. That's kind of how they do the calculation. It was up 2.7% in June from the previous year. And overall, this is the highest inflation increase since February of this year. So it's back to going up again. This is higher than what economists expected. And it was higher than what the 2.4%, which was in May. So, but that number is actually a little higher than 2.7% when you add in fuel and food prices. So there's like a separate calculation for those two things because they are a little more volatile in pricing. So, but when you add those in, inflation actually went up 2.9% last month. So it looks like the Trump and Republican tariffs, or as I call them, taxes, because of course all tariffs are taxes on imports, goods coming from other countries that we are buying in the United States. It's just a tax. We are paying higher prices. So, some of Trump's tariffs have been kicking in, and there's going to be more. I'll talk about that here if I have enough time. But so you're starting to notice that the everyday goods prices are going up. And as I've said a number of times previously, and I think I will continue as this gets worse, this is also giving businesses an excuse to raise their prices, even if they don't have to, even if they're not affected by the tariffs all that much. They're going to say, well, the tariffs are raising my costs. So despite what the president says, okay, people, consumers who buy goods are the ones who are paying the tariffs, not China, not Canada, not Mexico. Okay, we are. And when Trump runs around saying, "Oh, we've gotten billions of dollars in from the federal government," yeah, this is another way to steal money from us, right? Because we are the ones paying the tax, paying the tariff, and then that money then goes to the federal government, and then Trump is doing God knows what with that money, our money. Okay, not China's money, not Mexico's money, not Canada's money, our money. Okay, and this number is only going to get worse, I think. And a number of economists say the same thing. We haven't really started seeing these tariffs kicked in yet. Plus, Trump's talking about imposing a bunch of other ones on August 1st. Right, and so it takes a little bit of time in the economy for these tariffs to kick in, and you're starting to see it now. And it's only going to get worse. So some of the things that were hit the hardest by the tariff were household furnishings. They went up 1% in price, which is higher than last month. Appliances were up 1.9% in price. And that was more than double last month's increase. Gas prices went up. Trump's running around saying, "Oh, gas prices are down to $1.99 a gallon." I'm like, yeah, where's that at? Lying again. Gas prices are going up. Grocery prices are up 0.3% in June. Clothing went up. Housing is up 4%. By the way, eggs, they're still up 27% price from last year. All you people who were all mad at Biden for egg prices, well, they're 27% higher than where they were a year ago. Now, how's that turning out for you? And these increases likely won't stop. Right? So, businesses are going to be forced to either eat the tariffs themselves or pass them on to us. And, of course, which one are they going to pick? Right? And then, along with inflation going up, the Federal Reserve is not going to lower the interest rates on their loan rates because inflation is going to start going up, and typically they don't lower rates. So they're probably going to keep rates at the end of July. They're probably going to keep them where they are now. So consumers aren't going to get a break with lower interest costs on loans. And if this really gets bad, if inflation really starts towards the end of the summer or beginning of the fall, if it's really getting higher, you're going to see the Federal Reserve raise probably interest rates again. So, not surprisingly, Republicans and the orange turd, as I call them, are out there saying, well, inflation's very low. That's what he put in a Truth Social. Very low inflation. The Fed should cut rates by 3%. Now, right now, the Fed is around 4.33% or 4.5%, depending on which bank you're dealing with. But that's the effective rate for what they're charging for interest. So if you all of a sudden cut 3%, you're going to raise inflation a lot more because you're going to get a lot more money added to the economy. You're getting a lot more loan. People are going to take loans out. We're going to get a lot more debt. And then when inflation keeps getting worse and worse and worse, people are going to have to make a choice. What bills am I going to pay? And that's not going to help our economy. But this is what the Republicans wanted when people voted for them. They're not going to stop whining about it when prices go up. They're just going to be blaming Joe Biden. It's Joe Biden's fault. And let's not forget that, they just passed $5 trillion increase in the national debt in the big, horrible bill. So we got to pay more interest on the national debt, too. Again, this just goes to show you how politics matters in your everyday life, and you're going to start seeing the effects of it more and more. All right, we'll talk to you next week. Take care.